Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to the channel. So we're back working on the canoe. We're running out of time. We're into September now and got to get this thing finished out. So if you're new to this series or new to the channel, we're building a cedar strip canoe. It's an 18.5-foot white guide canoe. It's out of the book from Gilpatrick, How to Build a Strip Canoe. We are now at the stage to epoxy. We finished laying the strips in the last video, and then we hauled the canoe out of the garage. I had to shape the ends of the canoe, which I'm pretty happy with. The ends of the canoe came out quite nice. So we had to shape those. We used a rasp to do that. And then we had to sand down the entire hull, which was a lot of work. Oh, and I can't forget, we had to pull all the staples out of this canoe. And if you're wondering how many staples it is, take a look at this. These were all the staples that we had to pull out of that canoe. So that was a tedious job in itself right there. We sanded the hull down with 60 grit sandpaper. You really don't need to go any finer than that because any of the scratches and lines and whatnot that are going to be in it are going to be covered up by the epoxy and fiberglass, and you won't be able to see them once the canoe's finished. So next on the agenda is we need to patch any holes, any gaps that are in the canoe, and inevitably there's going to be holes and gaps here and there. Kind of touch up any imperfections with a filler, and what we're going to use for a filler is the epoxy that we're going to finish the canoe in and fiberglass the canoe. We're going to use that epoxy, mix up a small batch, and we saved our cedar flour from when we were sanding. And so it's basically just the sawdust from sanding the canoe. We saved that. We'll use a little bit of that cedar flour with some silica and then mix that with a little small batch of our epoxy. And we'll mix it up until it's about a peanut butter-like consistency. And we'll use that to go along and patch any gaps and whatnot we have in the canoe. So to fiberglass and finish the canoe, you need an epoxy. And I ended up going, there's a couple companies that I'm familiar with that are listed in the book. One is West Systems and the other is RAKA, or some people call it RAKA. So I called RAKA first, they're out of Florida. My father had used RAKA, had really good luck with them, came out really nice. So we have some experience with that. So I contacted them first, and I got a guy named Mark. And we kind of talked shop there for a little while. Super personable. Really helpful. I told him, I basically flat out was going to call both companies actually and just be like, hey, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm looking for, and how much do I need, what do I need? And right off the bat I tell him what I'm doing, and he's like, oh yeah, they'd built one of Gil's canoes before and they were going through all their experiences with that and what they used and what they recommended for epoxy. And I told him the size of the canoe I was building, and he, right off the top of his head, he knew how much fiberglass he needed to order, what lengths. Because what we're going to do is I need enough fiberglass to do the outside of the hull with one layer of 6-ounce fiberglass, and then the inside of the hull with one layer of 6-ounce fiberglass. And I'm also going to do underneath the first layer on the outside a football-shaped layer of fiberglass to basically give the bottom of the hull and the ends kind of a double layer of fiberglass just for reinforcement. So 18.5 foot, basically multiply that times 2, and you figure 21 feet. Just to round up to an even 7 yards, and multiply that times 2 because I'll need one for the outside and on the inside. So we're looking at about 14 yards for that. And then the football shaped piece of fiberglass, we went with 40 inches wide, and it was about 6 yards I believe I ordered for that. So, and he'd recommended for this canoe to do, they have kits, and he said I'd need about 2.5 gallons to do this canoe. And so that'd be 2.5 gallons of resin with the correct portion of hardener to go with that. He'd recommended the RAKA 127 low viscosity resin kit with the 350 non-blushing hardener. He also, he was telling me stories about them building their canoe, and I was telling him I just finished pulling all the staples and whatnot and how tedious it was, and they'd built a canoe, and I thought about this actually when I was pulling the staples. I'm like, there's gotta be a way to build this canoe without using staples. I could clamp a lot of things, and I ended up using a lot of clamps going forward, which I'm going to call him back and talk to him a little more about this. But he said in the middle of the center of their strong back, they basically used a screw to anchor bungee cords, and then used bungees to come up around when they were laying strips, and then basically just use like a sacrificial strip to bungee around. And they would do like 4 or 5 strips, wouldn't staple, would just use bungees. Get your bead and cove to come together nice and tight. And then they would do the opposite side, and they basically just went back and forth and didn't use a staple. And I thought about that and I thought, yeah, that's a fantastic idea. And it worked out well for them. So I may pick his brain a little more about that. But they were wicked helpful to work with, you know, made it easy. So I ended up not even calling West Systems. I was gonna call both companies and kind of just get a feel for each one, you know, who'd be able to help me the best, who was the most knowledgeable, who'd give me the best insight. And after talking to the guys at RAKA, I was like, yeah, I'll just order from them, piece of cake. This epoxy, the non-blushing, it's supposed to be, you know, pretty usable, higher humidity, higher temperature can be an issue. It's gonna shorten your pot life. This epoxy has a pot life of about 30 to 40 minutes, I believe. The warmer it is, the shorter your pot life's gonna be. The other thing you have to be aware of is, of course, from my experience of rod building, I've worked a lot with epoxies. Flex coat is one of the common ones I used with rod building. And anytime you mix up a batch of a 2-part epoxy, once you get everything thoroughly mixed, to get that spread out into a wider container, the more that epoxy is spread out, the slower it'll cure. There's a chemical reaction going on. It's an exothermic reaction. It produces heat and it kind of propagates itself. The more it's in close proximity to each other, it'll cure even faster. So if you spread that out over a wide area, you'll get a longer pot life out of it. So what I'll do is today, I gotta patch up some holes and gaps on this and I'll mix up the epoxy, then put it in a different vessel that's kind of wide open. I'll probably just use paper plate, kind of just have it in that paper plate so it's further spread out, and that'll extend the pot life of that even longer, so I have a little more time to work with it. With this epoxy, I don't need to sand in between coats if I do a coat within 24 to 48 hours. If it's longer than that, they recommend sanding. So yeah, let's mix up some epoxy and thicken it to a peanut butter-like consistency and start filling some holes. And what you'll notice is when those holes are being filled, they will darken. So I'm gonna have some dark spots on the canoe, but once the rest of the canoe is done, once it gets the first coat of epoxy, it should all match. And I will say the first coat, once we get everything filled in, we will then sand that down. So just sand those spots down and to make them nice and flush with the canoe. And then our first coat of epoxy is actually just gonna be a filler coat. So it's just gonna basically, this wood's gonna suck up a lot of epoxy. So we won't even fiberglass, we'll just put a coat of epoxy over the canoe in a day or two, let that dry for 24 to 48 hours, and then we can start fiberglassing and going forward from there. So let's fill some holes. All right, so let me show you real quick, just some things we're gonna fill. And I'm probably gonna be pretty meticulous when I go down through this canoe. Even if I get some little gaps or cracks, I'm gonna fill them. I don't think you have to, but I just want everything nice and flush, nice and sealed up. I don't have any major holes anywhere or major gaps. Maybe in the ends a little bit, where some of the ends didn't come together quite the way I would have liked them. But I'll show you. So right here, you can see right here. So we got some screw holes there. We'll go down to the other end. I think I can get some down here. You can see the same thing right here. We'll fill those in, get those to match up nicely. And then, yeah, some screw holes up there. So all in all, not too bad. Not perfect, you know, first time doing this. So we'll mix up a batch right now and seal everything up. All right, so I'm gonna mix this right here on the canoe. So we've got our cedar flower, we've got our silica. Actually, let me measure out my epoxy first. So they've got those really spelled out nicely. What I'm gonna do is I don't wanna mix too much, but you also don't wanna mix too little, and I'll tell you why. Especially, you know, it's something you find out if you work with epoxies a lot. You know, rod building, if I'm using it, use a lot of flex coat with rod building. And if you mix too small of a quantity, then if there's any error made whatsoever, then just a little error is gonna throw that proportion off by a lot. Because if you're looking at one relative to another, if you're looking at proportions, the larger overall quantity that you have, if one proportion's off a little bit, relative to the whole mix, it's not gonna be a big error. So relatively speaking, the smaller quantities you get, the more precise you have to be in your proportions, or else just one proportion being a little bit off is really gonna throw that whole mix off as a whole and can ruin your pot. So yeah, I'm sure that makes perfect sense. Yeah, too small of a quantity can be troublesome. Obviously too large of a quantity and I can't work with it all, I'm gonna have some waste. So I wanna try to find that sweet spot. We'll try that right there. We're gonna do, I got some nice increments right there. Okay, So we'll do 2 parts of resin. Looks good. 1 part hardener, like so. Get this mixed up. You really want to mix this up good. Get everything off the sides. You can see it swirl. You also want to try to, whenever I worked with epoxies, you don't want to incorporate too many. Obviously, it's not going to be a big deal here because we're using it just for patchwork. But on a finished coat, you don't want to incorporate too many air bubbles into it by mixing really vigorously. Looks pretty good. So I'm basically going to do a tablespoon of each, and we'll just go back and forth. It smells like every other epoxy I've worked with. I don't know, it's my first time doing this, so we'll see. Not quite peanut butter yet, is it? 2 scoops. Seven. We'll do 7. 6.5. Right. Yeah, it looks about like a peanut butter consistency. Maybe it could be a hair thicker. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go station by station and work my way down. So I'm going to start right in the middle and work towards one end. And I'm just going to be very intentional about doing everything in a segmented order so I can make sure I get every gap. Well there, that went quicker than I thought. Ended up taking 2 potfuls, and I didn't waste any, didn't have anything hardened up. So it ended up being about 4 ounces. They had some nice equal part measurements on the side of that container. Just use that. So I'm gonna let this cure, and I'll just give you a quick little idea what everything looks like. You can start to see the natural colors of the Canoe pretty good. But yeah, that actually went pretty quick, pretty good. We'll see how this cures up. Tomorrow I'll sand this and hopefully start the process of fiberglassing. So I'll put a link in the description below to the book that we're using and to the epoxy. Again, super personable, super nice guys. So far, I'd really recommend them. Where the rubber meets the road is when we start fiberglassing, and we'll see how that turns out. Everything's smooth and clear. No haze, no cloudiness. This is where most of the money is being put into the Canoe, is the fiberglassing and the epoxy. And I'll put a total cost at this point so far, so I'll put that up right now. There, another phase done. All those gaps are filled. So I hope you liked it. Thanks for tuning in, and stay tuned. Next time we're back, we're gonna start to see the natural colors of this Canoe, see how that epoxy and fiberglass lays out. So hope you enjoyed it. Till next time, get outside. It's good for the soul. See ya.